So welcome everybody to this webinar that is a result of approximately 6 months research looking at Createch in the UK, particularly focusing on sustainability policy linkages and company activity in the sector. The project is delivered via the Centre for Sustainable Design at UCA with funding from Research England. And I'm here, Martin Charter, with my colleague Trevor Davis, and the structure will be, I'll just make a brief introduction and then Trevor will sort of drive the presentation, and then I'll come in at the end just for a few sort of concluding remarks and recommendations and some sort of what next type of sort of discussions or points. So again, welcome everybody. So I've done that, so I'll move from that. Over the last couple of years, we've done a couple of surveys looking out to 2030 around creative industries, sustainability and Industry 4.0, very much looking to the future. And we really highlighted within those studies the growth in the sector. In despite the pandemic, there is still going to be significant growth, we predict, until the end of this decade. The figures there are in the graph, and one just indicator of that both Trevor and myself picked up was, I think it was something that was just broadcast by Creative Industries Council over Twitter, that the film industry is going to be looking for 22,000 additional staff over the next 3 years. So that's just one segment of the 12 or so segments of the creative industries. What we've done in this project is to particularly focus in on the Createch sector. I won't go into the details of that because Trevor will explore that in more detail, but it's a segment of the sector that really is starting to emerge as we start to see more continued technological acceleration. And really part of this study was really to understand the sector, the Createch sector in more detail, and to do that, there was a lot of detailed research that Trevor did to identify and sift out the different companies. We also were there, the goal was to try and understand more broadly, the drivers from a sustainability and others perspective on the Createch sector, and to attempt to develop a maturity profile of companies in the sector in relation to circularity, in relation to sustainability, of which climate change and net zero are at the top of the agenda. What we also have developed and had a goal to develop and have developed is a tool to help companies think through that process in terms of their awareness and understanding of sustainability issues. So without further ado, I'll pass across to Trevor.
Thank you very much, Martin. And just very quickly for the people who don't know me, my background is as a distinguished engineer in IBM. So that's the technology side of me. And I have a whole other side to me, which is more on the creative side. So I feel I can bring kind of both of these to the subject. But it's very much, as Martin said, this subsector of the creative industries, Createch, that we wanted to dive into, because that chart we showed you a few moments ago could be substantially Createch by 2030 if the growth rate continues. It's a double-digit growth rate. Next slide, please. So what do we actually do? The first thing is we looked at the basic definition of Createch, because I think, as many on the call will know, it's relatively new. There are many different perspectives on this. There are very simple definitions, like it's the intersection of creativity and technology, and then there are more detailed definitions from different areas. And we wanted to see if we could find one that maybe helped us to do our research a little bit more precisely. We then looked at how that more precise definition mapped onto UK policy strategy and regulations. And out of that, we then designed a 33-question questionnaire, quite a big one, and ran that over a few hundred companies in the UK. So that took place in the first 3 months, pretty much the first 3 months of the year. The next 3 months have really been about then digging into that data through interviews, talking to people regionally across the country, some excellent deep dive interviews. Some of the interviewees are actually on the call. Thank you very much. And then out of that, we wrote the report, which has gone up on the website today, and developed this tool that Martin was talking about. So you can see some of the statistics at the bottom of the screen. Next slide, please. So what we mean by a tighter definition or a refined definition of Createch. So one of the things that we did was to look at the fintech world, financial technology companies, because that's probably the most mature of these business segments that has the tech word on the end. And out of that, we then really took some lessons and then applied that to the definitions that are in play at the moment around Createch. So the first thing was, it's clear that to be labeled Createch, particularly from an investor point of view, this has to be a growth-oriented business or growth-oriented organization, and it has to be aligned with the creative industries or the cultural sector as we understand it today. So that immediately eliminated a number of kind of businesses that really were either in the sport or medical or educational kind of area, but they had, you know, maybe some very creative content at their heart. The second thing is it is a tech, so therefore technology assets have to be central to the value proposition. So again, immediately that throws out kind of businesses which are just using the tools to create content, using off-the-shelf tools. And in particular, it brings into the definition companies that are doing R&D or where there's other forms of technology, innovation, adaptation. And then finally, these are very much kind of newer business model companies. They're, you know, if you look in the fintech world, they are disruptive businesses as a rule. What we're looking for here are businesses that are based on a business model that can only really be delivered through digital technologies. So out of that, we developed a decision tree, and using that decision tree, we then started to filter down the kind of companies that we felt belonged in our core definition. Next slide, please. So here's a few examples of companies or types of companies that we would include and exclude. Again, I'm not going to read the slide to you. You can have a look at it, and it's in the report and with some supporting text. What I would like to point out are, you know, a couple of them in particular, which I think are very important. So the first line in particular, agencies and studios. There are many many studios in the UK that label themselves intentionally or accidentally as Createch. But when you dig into what they're actually doing and how they do it, it's maybe a couple of creative people with some off-the-shelf tools that we would all recognize, maybe making some immersive content for somebody else. We felt that those kind of businesses don't really meet the definition of Createch as we see it for this piece of research. It's not to diminish them, but simply to say that they're out of our scope. If I do that with a contrast with the second line, an agency or studio that actually has some patents for augmented reality technology, for instance, we would say that that business was in scope. And there are quite a number that have patents or other forms of intellectual property. Now, is it a perfect definition? No, of course not. We did find some where we really struggled to work out exactly whether they fitted in or not. So about a third of the way down the table, you'll see this software company that's making plugins for CAD systems. They're maybe selling 80% of those to people making digital fashion, but the other 20% is going to engineering type businesses. Well, are they in or are they out? Kind of depends on their business roadmap. But this is basically how we went about mapping our version of Createch. So next slide. So what does that actually give us for the UK? It gives us really around about 1,900 companies. This was extracted from both publicly available sources and subscription sources like Crunchbase. And we labeled about a third of them as core Createchs. So they are absolutely 100% on that definition. So they have the technology side, they have technology assets, etc. We then have what we call Createch adjacent. This is the business ecosystem really around these Createch companies. Many of these are pure play technology companies. They're cloud providers, they're software tool providers, middleware providers for the people who like the techie terms. And then there's a number, about a fifth left over, who I suppose it'd be tempting to call them mostly other, but many of these were e-commerce companies who are really selling goods that are made by creators and makers. It is unclear to what extent they are really Createch, but we did actually give some of these companies the benefit of the doubt. And then there's a small number of companies which are in the other category, some of which are, for instance, IP legal businesses that are using, for instance, artificial intelligence to assist them in their work in the creative industries. So they're highly specialized. So that 29% is basically what we've used for our deep dive analysis and profiling of Createch in the UK. Next slide, please. So what technologies are being used by these companies? We profiled 265 of these companies, and you can see, not too surprisingly, the top ones are either artificial intelligence or the technologies associated with the world of immersive kind of entertainment or immersive content. But you also get quite a few which are, in areas like advanced analytics or generic web technologies where people have written very, very specialist kind of pieces of code, which sometimes they've been able to protect through hard intellectual property, such as patents, by, for instance, going to California to register the patent. So quite a wide range of technology, but centered around this little group at the top. You will notice as well that we do have the bête noire of the technology world, blockchain, there. So we had 10 of companies saying that they were using blockchain technology, for instance, around games and gamification, I think was the most common use. Somebody's asked the question in the chat box about, not surprising that we don't have more 5G or kind of mobile type solutions in there. Yeah, I think that is a little disappointing, particularly where I live in the country, because we have one of the kind of global centers of development just down the road. But this is what we found in the data. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that part of our research was then to look at these core Createch companies in the policy context in the UK. It's a UK piece of work. Next slide, please. So let's start with what are people in Parliament talking about. I had a look at Hansard, looked at the number of debates, really looking at, to start with, what are people talking about in terms of sustainability in general, and then starting to look within the creative industries and for Createch in particular. And that's why you've got a bit of a mix here. Clearly, net zero is a big topic and has been a big topic for some time. And at the other extreme, you can see that Createch is a very new topic. And if you look at Lord Aberdare's question on the right-hand side, you can see that it's only really in 2021 that we start to get some serious parliamentary debate going around Createch. So this is clearly a very new subject. I think also in this list, we have biodiversity as number 2. And I'd say this is probably the one that the Createch companies that we looked at struggled with most. They could not see themselves in that kind of area. Next slide, please. So we do have a lot of quite excellent documents in the UK and some very stretching targets. If you just do a very simple thing, which is download all of them and search for the word Createch, you won't actually find it in there. And not only that, the way that these documents are structured, it seems to be that most of them are based around assumptions about energy intensive industries. And Createch is not seen as one. But I think, as many of us on the call will know, that may not necessarily be the case. We are talking about businesses which have the potential to reach Netflix kind of scale, with all of the server farms that go with that, with all of the end consumer device energy consumption that goes with that at the global scale. And so a company that maybe is 20 people today here in the UK could be several thousand within a few years and could have billions of hours of watching time associated with it. So these are energy intensive industries, but they're just not recognized as such. Next slide, please. So let's move on to the survey. Next slide, please. So who is in the survey? So first of all, we had 80 plus people complete the survey in total. Most questions we had over 60 people respond to. And about 60% are startups, and half of them are really dominated by business models, which I think is quite interesting, because when we think of immersive entertainment, which is the subsector alignment which is most common here, we tend to think of it as a kind of a business to consumer or business to audience kind of interaction. But in reality, many of these businesses are providing tools and content for other businesses that then provide the business to consumer interface. It's also very interesting if you look at this subsector alignment to see that quite a number actually chose to say, yeah, we are aligned with a subsector, but we also think we're in software development. So a quarter of companies ticked the software development box as well as one of the other boxes. And even though we weren't particularly aiming to attract arts and culture organizations directly to our survey, again, 1 in 5 saw themselves as aligned to the arts and culture subsector as well. So I think there's kind of an interesting mix in here. And then in terms of geography, clearly Createchs are all over the UK, perhaps not surprisingly dominated by London and the kind of infrastructure around London, Southeast and Southwest coming up second and third, and then the East of England kind of trading a little bit behind that. Again, I think if you're looking for a leveling up kind of agenda, Createch plays very well to that, in the sense that anybody could really do a Createch kind of startup in their own home anywhere in the country. But as you can see here, that's not really how it's playing out today. What we also did was some statistical tests on the survey to see if it actually matched the database that we'd created by desk research, and in fact it is representative. The main difference is there's slightly more business to consumer startups in our survey demographic compared to our main reference database. Next slide, please. So not surprisingly, when you ask people what you think of sustainability, it's climate change and the whole environmental sustainability agenda, followed by net zero. broader concepts like waste reduction and societal impact also quite high. What Martin and I have seen in other kind of pieces of research is that the circular economy tends to trail in people's understanding. And it's also quite interesting, as I said earlier, to see the biodiversity gain. One of the top debated areas in Parliament is right at the very bottom of this list. So essentially, it's a net zero climate change kind of mindset that's dominating here. Next slide, please. Now, we asked people to what extent do they agree and disagree with a number of statements around sustainability, and it was very gratifying to see that 80% said it's core to their strategy, and also that over 70% said that technology is, at least in part, essential to delivering their sustainability plans. Now, contrast that with the red blocks on your screen. 50% at least partially disagree that they have any kind of documented plans, and reporting is clearly a gap. So we have this kind of tension in the findings, which is people saying, yeah, we're all about sustainability, but no, we haven't written any of it down. Next slide, please. I think part of the reason for that is the way that these startup and scale up kind of businesses are structured. So when we ask people about who's responsible for sustainability, bottom of the list is a specialist environmental sustainability or governance type lead. And right at the top are really the founders and the CEOs and the leadership of the organization, because quite often these are very, very small kind of businesses. What I've learned over many years is when people say no one or everyone, those are basically saying the same thing. So we have really a responsibility gap here. And then when you ask people a little bit more specific questions about documentation, you find that 60% say they have no documented policies at all. So these are really significant gaps. Next slide, please. I mentioned the measurement is a challenge. We asked 4 questions really around measurement. One is about end-to-end visibility. One is around reporting on that visibility to investors and other stakeholders. A question around lifecycle measurement, and then the corresponding question around reporting on that. And again, you can see that over 50% say they don't have visibility, over 80% say they don't measure and report, and similar kind of proportions for the life cycle of products and services. So, again, this is quite an interesting finding for high technology companies, which generally tend to be quite good at measuring and reporting things, but clearly this is an area they struggle with. Next slide, please. We also wanted to know from people, where were they being influenced from in terms of their thinking on sustainability. So we asked people to basically say to what extent are these different categories here sources of influence, and this is in the decreasing order of importance. So the ones to look at are the kind of turquoisey blue and kind of yellowy kind of colored blocks. And you can see that right at the top of the list are the internal drivers. It's employees that are really kind of driving this, followed by customers. And then right at the very bottom, you get investors. And we've picked up this tension all the way through the research between particularly venture capital and business angel type investors focus on growth through customer acquisition versus more purpose-driven organizations who really want to do the right thing for the planet and the people that live upon it. You can see on this list as well that international governments seem to come higher, and I think this is kind of the influence of the new Green Deal from Europe still kind of coming through, and UK local government actually kind of ranked higher than central government. And this is, I think, is very important. I'm going to come back to this local element in a few moments. Next slide, please. So given that employees and customers come right at the top of the list, I think it may answer why so many of the respondents actually said that they were thinking of becoming a B Corporation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this certification process, it's probably the leading sustainability certification process in the world. A quarter of our respondents said that they're thinking of going down this route in a few years. I would say, given where they are in terms of their documentation and the other priorities they maybe have as a business, that would be a big ambition to have and maybe unachievable for some of them. And also the B Corporation certification process, even the one for small and medium-sized companies, is probably too heavy for a startup, and certainly doesn't reflect these very fast-moving startups like the ones we're dealing with here. Next slide, please. So let's go back to policy for a moment. So when we asked people about the relevance of different policy areas within the UK, we did get quite a strong positive response around environmental targets and decarbonisation. So quite high percentages here. But when we asked the corresponding question about, legislation and law and acts of parliament, do you feel these apply to you? The answer came back, not so sure. So we only got 27% saying, 27% actually came back and said, no, these are not relevant to us. So not really seeing the traction of the legislation. And I think when we talk through some of the interviews, you'll hear why that actually is. Next slide, please. There is significant dependency in the companies that we studied on public funding, both for R&D and also for more general collaboration around their ambitions. So two charts here. The left-hand one is really looking at where they're getting public funding for sustainability, technology-based sustainability projects. You can see that kind of Innovate UK, UKRI more generally, right at the top of the list there. R&D tax credits, kind of coming in quite strongly. On the right-hand side, if you look more at the kind of broader collaborations, you can see many of the Creative Cluster program entities on that list. You can see universities coming through quite strongly and other forms of local and regional hub. And there's that kind of local or regional element coming through again. Next slide, please. So Martin mentioned sustainability maturity, and I'm going to let Martin just take over for a few moments and just explain a bit of the background here, because there is a long history with Martin and measuring sustainability maturity.
Well, thanks very much, Trevor. Yeah, I mean, back in I'm forgetting exactly what it was, the early sort of 2000s, I was really doing a lot of work on the ground with SMEs and actually some large businesses. And what became clear to me, there was, if you look at different parts of organizations, you look at different people in organizations, you can have different levels of awareness and understanding. And that might be, within a small organization, you may have some people who've got relatively little knowledge of, for example, a topic like sustainability, or some people who've got quite advanced knowledge about sustainability. And that might be driven by a variety of, points. But that also may be true in organizations as well. You might have different business units that have different levels of awareness around different topics. And some businesses will use different business units or business divisions to drive initiatives on behalf of the organization overall. So I came up with a highly, a sort of basic model that basically says for any topic, sustainability, in an organization and amongst individuals, some individuals may have relatively zero awareness, some may have basic awareness, some may have intermediate, and some may have advanced awareness. And often what you've seen, particularly on the tools development side, is that highly complex tools are developed from outside organizations, and they don't get used because perhaps most people are at zero or basic knowledge. So this was then sort of, Trevor and I had a sort of chat about this. It was coming up in another European project we're involved in. And Trevor said, well, I think I have a way to start to quantify this and bring this into our survey work. So, and indeed Trevor was able to do that. So I'll pass the ball back to Trevor to highlight what we found.
Thank you very much, Martin. So next slide, please. So ZBIA, Zero Basic, Intermediate, Advanced. What we did was we designed a number of questions in the survey so that we could extract quantitative information from the qualitative answers. So basically, you got a score, a weighted score, depending on how you answered particular questions. And then what we did was we did some machine learning based on our data set and identified which of these questions was actually driving some of the outcomes that we labeled as sustainability. And so what I've done on this chart here, rather than showing you the Python code, is just to list down the kind of areas within the questionnaire that actually were driving the calculation, and to give you a kind of snapshot of the answers that you would expect for different levels of maturity. So again, you can just kind of browse this for yourself at the moment. But as you might imagine, you know, if I just pick one line, external pressure, we had several questions which could have been interpreted as external pressure. Our machine learning gave us a subset of those, and then we were able to turn people's answers into a 0 to 3, I think, score. And then you basically add all of these kind of numeric answers up, and you have a maturity score, which I will not delay any longer before revealing. Next slide, please. So here are our 4 segments. You can see the number of businesses in each of these different segments and the percentages at the bottom. And not too surprisingly, perhaps, over 70% are basic or 0. And there is a little bit of a correlation with, you know, whether you're a startup or scale up or an established kind of business. But it's not a tremendously strong correlation. It seems to have a better correlation either with the subsegment that you're kind of aligned to, or with whether you're a purpose-driven organization or not, or you see yourself very much as a purpose-driven organization. So quite a lot of maturity to be developed within this subset. And I think if we look at a couple of subsector alignments, next slide, please. So here are 2 contrasting ones. So these are box whisker plots for those who haven't seen these before. The box goes from the lower quartile to the upper quartile. The whiskers go out to 3 standard deviations away from the mean, and the horizontal black line is the median of the data. So the ones that said that they were almost entirely around concerned with software development, they're the ones that scored lower in the sample, less mature. If we look in contrast at fashion, the ones that said, yes, we are almost entirely about fashion, they scored higher. And I think the conclusion Martin and I came to is that basically the fashion industry has invested a lot of time in the last couple of years, making people aware of circularity. We've seen the rise of secondary markets for clothing and accessories. There's a lot in the press around the impact of fast fashion, in particular on sustainability. So not surprisingly, Createch kind of startups have picked up on this, and in some cases base their whole proposition around sustainability. Next slide, please. So if you're low maturity, what do you need to do to increase your maturity? I'm not going to say too much about that, but what I am going to say is something about the barriers that people reported. And as you can see here, the top three are really all around kind of knowledge and skill sets. Number one is, kind of having your own knowledge inside the business, either of regulations or sustainability more generally. And then the third one is really around the specialist technology skills that are needed, for instance, to build machine learning operations that are kind of low carbon, which is not a trivial thing. What's interesting for me about this is the extent to which people found it very difficult to access information. A constant complaint was everything's online. Government websites have got lots of information, but we can't find the most relevant one. And hey, we've got a business to run. We can't spend all day Googling. So there is a sense of that these companies really want to have face-to-face contact, or they want to have networking opportunities. Related to this is these Createch companies do not seem to participate in the major industry initiatives that are out there in the creative industries, of which there are many. So again, they miss out on those knowledge transfer opportunities, and they cite lack of time or just not even knowing they exist. Next slide, please.
Maybe I'll just make one point on that, Trevor, that it does very much align with particularly our first foresight study, that we found that there was this sort of gap for the micro and SMEs in the creative industries more generally. They felt sort of cut off from the initiatives, amongst the large transnationals. There was these organized networks for the large transnationals, but the small guys really weren't catered for, and they didn't really have networks, generally speaking, where they felt they could engage or pick up on sort of local information, generally speaking. So back to Trevor.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So we did interview 16 people in detail. These were typically CEOs and founders of the core Createch companies that we'd identified. We also kind of met policymakers online, involved in regional local policy, people who've been involved in bigger schemes as well, and some of the people involved in the creative clusters kind of program. Very rich findings. We're only going to share a little bit of it today. Next slide, please. I think, first of all, if you just stand back from these core Createch companies and kind of try and think about what does a founder or a CEO of one of these startups or scale-ups actually look like, they are quite interesting people. In fact, you, seeing some of them on the call, you are quite interesting people. So a real sense of purpose kind of came through in all of the interviews that I did. It's sometimes expressed very explicitly around sustainability, our relationship with nature. Quite a number of companies very heavily invested in diversity and inclusion, kind of real sense of care, for people and planet coming through. And as you might imagine, they saw sustainability as a real opportunity that's going to be around for decades. And very much it was personal, I think, for many of the people I spoke to. You got triggering events like a key film or a key speech or a TED talk that set people on their sustainability kind of journey. And not surprisingly, again, their motivation levels very high, and they were mostly self-educated. There are some people who had invested time and money in formal education around sustainability, but mostly we're talking about people who kind of had to go and find information and teach themselves about it. Their first place of kind of the first place they would go to look for regional and for support is regional and local. They're in a particular town that they've lived in maybe most of their life, or they've moved to. that's where they start looking for support for what they're doing, whether that's financial support or sustainability information. And all of them seem to be walking a tightrope. If they had external investors, external investors might say, we're all about, sustainable growth, etc. But when push comes to shove, what they really want is financial growth. And so how do you walk that tightrope seemed to be a very key skill. Let me just dwell on this regional and local piece for a little bit longer. Next slide, please. Again, from the kind of interviews, we got this very strong sense of, our investors might be a local business angel or a family, or they might be a venture capitalist that we met through some kind of local business kind of networking event. And there is a little bit of a double-edged sword here, because being on this list of Createch companies is fantastic in terms of profiling. And people do pick up on it, but investors don't really know what it is. And so sometimes being labeled EdTech or something else is smarter from a financial point of view. When we spoke to people about making that leap from local kind of policymakers and local support systems to central government, there was this sense that we're just not treated seriously. A phrase I've heard in quite a lot of discussions with central government is they talk about spillover from the creative industries. It's there to have to create employment and growth as a byproduct. But these companies are saying, no, we are the growth engine. Take us seriously. And then when it comes to the LEPs, the local enterprise zones and the associated growth hubs, there is this sense of the creative industries really becoming very important only very recently to them. But Createch is not something that's really discussed or understood. So again, there is this kind of disconnect. But where there is a
a parallel there, Trevor. Again, going back to our earlier studies, again, more broadly, but it still aligns with this, is how, to some extent, companies within the creative industries were often thought as a bit of a cottage industry. They weren't, formalized, weren't perceived to have, the plans and processes maybe some other sectors had. So there's definitely a perception issue overall, and also that aligns with Createch within it as well. So back to you, Trevor.
Yeah. So I think it's new. I think there's a very interesting new report out from the Creative Industries Council, looking at this regional and local, kind of area and looking at where the prioritization is. But it's new, and Createch doesn't really kind of feature in there. Next slide, please. So there is a kind of local ecosystem that these companies kind of exist within, which I think is really quite fascinating. So if we look at that central bubble for a moment, what comes through from the interviews is that having an anchor customer or an anchor institution, like the BBC or Channel 4, is really important. Sometimes these are not just customers, they're investors as well. And sometimes they're not just investors, they're actually providing knowledge and talent and expertise. When it comes to things like technology services, because these are businesses that are built on technology, it's amazing how much of that is provided within local information technology companies as opposed to kind of international cloud providers, although international cloud providers are very important. And likewise, there's a lot of local specialist professional services. I mean, if you walk just 10 minutes from my house, you'll find a firm of accountants who only work on the creative industries. Specialist facilities like studios for 3D scanning, local banks, local sustainability networks. So this is the heart of the business ecosystem. And then there's this kind of outreach really to kind of the broader clusters of creative industries across all of the sectors, subsectors on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, to this really important relationship between local councils, county councils and mayors where they exist and the LEPs and the growth hubs. And I think it's getting all of this working together that is probably the big challenge for policymakers, centrally and locally, to make the Createch kind of subsector work well. Next slide, please. So this is where it's working well at the moment from the interviews that we've done. Obviously, just a snapshot. And I think what strikes me when I look at this list is how micro all of these are. You know, Lambeth Net Zero Accelerator, you know, kind of Buckinghamshire Business First, you know, Somerset Business Agency. You know, these are not the more obvious kind of big kind of UK sources of support for sustainability. And some of the support that's given here is face-to-face. It's provided kind of in a very easy to consume micro fashion for these businesses. The question is, how do you scale this kind of very kind of micro kind of model? Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Martin to kind of give you the conclusions, but if I can just say one last thing. I think having done the survey and the desk research, I am convinced that the core Createch segment that we've identified is a thing and worth concentrating on if we believe, as I do, and Martin does, that core Createch is potentially a very powerful growth engine for the UK. Over to you, Martin.
So thanks, Trevor. And again, it really, you know, building on that point, it really reinforces my gut feel initially when I first picked up on it, that there was something there, and we've been able to sort of find out, you know, much more granular detail, and it has meant, you know, in effect, a lot of hard work by Trevor going back to, you know, the grassroots and building up a picture from the ground. So we continue to believe from the research, building on the platform of the two first broader Creative Industries 2030 reports, that there is tremendous growth potential for Createch. But, you know, magic comes with a price. There are sustainability impacts with any organization, and particularly, you know, for Createch companies that are using technology active products. I mean, the biggest environmental impact is going to be energy and CO2 emissions, and that's from the use of their technology right through to the source of the energy to use the technology. So I think, picked up that some of the awareness around this wasn't as high as it could be, and indeed, you know, as we were dealing with a lot of smaller micro business, particularly a lot of startups in the space, you know, people are scrabbling to get their business together, and they're prioritizing getting their products out, their technologies up, their websites up, for example, and unless it's a mission-driven business, maybe sometimes sustainability is sort of on the B pile a bit, and maybe a policy statement might go up, but a commitment, you know, more detailed commitments in terms of plans and strategies and action plans aren't really haven't really been developed by the vast majority of the organizations. So, you know, there are many creative clusters around the UK, and also micro clusters. You know, but if we've started to sort of pick up in Surrey, there are sort of, you know, yeah, again, it's a cluster. What's the difference between a micro cluster and a cluster? You know, and is a cluster formalized, designed to be a cluster, or it's a dotted line around a few companies? But this does exist. It has been documented, but perhaps this hasn't really been fully picked up in national and regional policy, other than particularly the focus around the southwest, where resources are being driven. So the LEPs, generally speaking, haven't all picked up creative industries per se, and certainly haven't picked up Createch. So Createch is within any form of economic plan or strategy at a national level, a regional level, or further down, is not really being picked up yet. Now, we don't know if UK is any different from any other country, but that certainly be another interesting issue to explore. Are there other countries that are perhaps picking up the potential of Createch companies and getting behind them and developing structures and systems to advance those companies? So, as highlighted there, a lot of the Createch companies are at a sort of quite a basic level of sustainability maturity, and really the needs that we found were around basic mechanisms to just follow legislation, which initiatives to follow, how to start on the sustainability journey. So again, there isn't an immediate need for complex tools. It's basic tools to get people sort of moving, and tools and processes that help people integrate it into their day-to-day working. Very much we picked up from this and the other surveys that a lot of these fast-moving startups and early-stage companies, they don't have time to go to a sort of a 2-week course or a summer school. They want bite-sized courses, bite-sized information. They want specific responses to specific questions, but they also need to have, be aware of what's going on, but not in a form where they, have to spend a lot of time trying to analyze it. So trying to find the shape of the support is important. That's something that we're going to be looking at into the future. There's an urgent need for more robust management, robust measurement of the impacts of metaverse, AI, and blockchain. And indeed, we've been picking this up through other things we've been looking at. Really, some of the, particularly the energy issues associated with virtual fashion or blockchain or metaverse. There are various people coming out with various calculations, but perhaps those calculations are based on often a back of a sort of fag packet calculation. The calculations are, and the assumptions are not clear. There are the broader issues to do with streaming that have been picked up, but they also align to these other areas as well. But there are also, of course, broader ethical concerns as well as environmental concerns around some of these technologies. And again, on a slightly different angle, some of the companies express difficulty in just keeping up to date with all the new technologies that they might use. There's the ambitions to be B Corps, but perhaps there's a lot of aspiration. People trying to be positive, particularly startups. This is what we want to be. We want to align with our mission statement, but getting B Corp status is a complex and time-consuming initiative. So it's a very serious commitment. And so perhaps there's the desire, but there isn't necessarily the understanding of the depth that is required to achieve some of these certifications. There is a gap in relevant sustainability skills and knowledge, and part of what we picked up in another recent survey in the creative industries, one other segment of the creative industries, is that that particular sector is using a lot of consultants and others to bring in expertise. And so a lot of the knowledge actually isn't sitting within the firm. So, and as Trevor mentioned earlier, the key drivers to improve sustainability within the Createch businesses are A, employers, and B, customers. So the issue is, if we see a certain growth and tightening of what I see as we're sitting in my view, the fifth green consumer wave, and if that is longer and deeper, without building competence and knowledge, and maybe moving from zero to basic and basic to intermediate, as new questions come from customers, maybe companies may have some challenges there. We already just recently picked up that the BBC are employing a sustainability manager purely related to Scope 3 emissions. And that will inevitably mean more questions starting to flow through supply chains to Createchs and others. So we believe there's a need for a refined definition, and that we believe will help investors and policymakers. So our 15 recommendations, I'll move through these very quickly. Firstly, to adopt the core Createch definition, the tighter definition with the 3 criteria, with IP, digital assets sitting right in the middle there. Invest in further research to expand and extend the knowledge of the ecosystems that surround Createch businesses, the enablers for those Createch businesses. Engage with DCMS and the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, really to explore the development of more robust Createch operating models. To develop a tool to help Createch companies move through their maturity in terms of sustainability. Develop an actual business checklist and relevant, clear communications plans that help Createch companies navigate through relevant UK policies and laws and other drivers. Research to quantify the impact of Createch on greenhouse gas emissions, as Trevor gave that example, that Netflix example, the extent, and this is more detailed, more in the report, that I think we were estimating that Netflix indirect and direct energy impacts might be as close to nearly 25% of all SMEs. So it's quite a significant, energy impact there. It's not an invisible sector. It's not defined as an energy intensive sector, but, energy is used. If you're rendering in games, there may be a Createch games company or perhaps something linked to virtual fashion. The rendering process to produce, the solutions there is very energy intensive. So if we think that that's been underestimated, and certainly there's very poor understanding of that at the moment. Perhaps the need for a development of a B Corp Light certification for those mission-driven businesses that really want to drive things. Also the need for a competency framework, perhaps around the job title or job function of creative technologists. At the moment we picked up it's perhaps more loosely used in industry, but what are the needs of those Createch companies in terms of skills and knowledge for the future? And how can that link to higher education to help work with companies to supply those skills and knowledge for the future? Very much a need to create a new forum or fora, or to actually help Createch founders with sustainability, with other issues, creating or adapting a technology readiness level to the relevance of the Createch companies, raising awareness amongst the LEPs regarding the growth potential of Createch companies, and perhaps integrating that with low carbon, resource efficient and inclusive agendas that the LEPs also have. Because there is, as we've highlighted, there is this potential energy intensity and low carbon, relevance to this agenda as well. So we also recommend that the local industrial plans from the LEPs are reviewed to consider Createch companies. And also there is a need for more research into regional and local support in Northern Ireland, Scotland, etc. And just in closing, just reinforcing what both of us said later, the Createch report is up on the website now with our two previous foresighting projects. And we have also developed this ZB model or checklist to help those early stage companies think through sustainability issues. And we've already trialed it with a couple of startup companies who both found it very useful and have both stated that they would be using this within their teams to start to raise awareness and understanding. So thank you very much for your attention. And I think we've got perhaps about sort of 10 minutes for questions. And if people, have any questions or observations, or did we miss something, or don't you fervently disagree with anything we said, please chime in and and join the discussion. I don't know if you picked on anything up there from the chat, Trevor.
Actually, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff in the chat, so it's probably worth people having a look. But there's one thing that just popped up a few seconds ago from Ground Waves, which is, really what we need is a kind of a national equipment pool for the kind of high capital expenditure items like volumetric capture studios. And I think that's really true, because I think if you just did a quick Google for volumetric capture studios in the UK, you probably only find a handful. Well, I can tell you from personal experience, there are hundreds of them, but they're all kind of owned by media agencies or creative agencies, and they have them mostly for their own kind of use at the moment. But if there was a way of kind of accessing that as a network, then that could actually be very, very helpful, because those are generally going to help us with a low carbon economy.
So, in lateral thinking, I've come up with some similar systems, actually early stage for 3D printing, where in effect, there are networks out there for people to, identify 3D printers in their regions. So again, could there be a sort of a similar system developed to access these and perhaps other technologies as well?
I think you need a Createch for this.
You can indeed, Trevor. That's maybe an opportunity we need to think about. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. There was another point, which is, more generally, infrastructure is, kind of a problem. And yeah, I mean, I think Martin and I've kind of picked this up pretty systematically as we've gone through the last two reports and this one as well, which is that there is a kind of ambition to put in place the right kind of digital infrastructure that would support Createch companies. But firstly, it's not necessarily progressing evenly across the country. Secondly, it's not necessarily affordable for startups. For instance, I was talking to a local startup by me. He's just had to pay, I think it's £5,000 for a fibre line straight to his office, and he's paying £500 a month for his bandwidth. That is a lot of money for a startup. So again, there are kind of issues like that out there. So I think this is a good point that's being raised by somebody.
Another thing sort of building on that is, whilst we and others have identified perhaps clusters, whether that's more top down rather than bottom up. So whilst there does seem to be a sort of, let's say, an interactive cluster in the southwest around Bristol and maybe Bath, perhaps some of those top down clusters, are more they've been identified because organizations have sort of seen there's a series of these companies in an area, and then they've called it cluster. Now, what I found, particularly when I was doing work with over 500 eco-innovative companies, this is outside the Createch sector, that a lot of those companies actually cut their own furrow, and they don't know who to contact. And therefore there is a real role for catalysts to help connect people up, and that's certainly a role of more, let's say, bottom-up cluster development and network development that particularly maybe the local government or the triple helix system could evolve with the universities. It's actually, again, going back, as I think from this and other work, is actually going back to the real needs of these companies and not necessarily what the perceived needs are. So I think there's very much a premium on going back and trying to identify what the real gaps are, what are the obstacles. And one of the things Trevor and I was talking about earlier was the whole issues around scale up of some of these businesses and the whole challenges around sort of Death Valley. For example, if there is real significant potential for these businesses to potentially scale, how do we start to deal with that Death Valley, issue?
By Death Valley, you mean that transition from startup to scale up?
Indeed. So as Trevor mentioned earlier, you could theoretically start a Createch in your bedroom, but it's that stage where you move to a smaller critical mass. You start to acquire customers. Your technologies evolve. You move to maybe wanting to employ more people to do more stuff, where you need more capital, you need different sorts of capital. So I think some sort of strategy as well at a local and regional level to actually engage and help companies think through that. So borrowing from the sort of Silicon Valley type of system where it's planned and evolved, and there are unique things to do with Silicon Valley, but that is one of the things that I've found with my micro and SME networks in the past, is those systems are badly designed in the UK. So they're not how you connect up with the different parts of the ecosystem. With Trevor's excellent diagram there, it's very much left to the individual companies to find their own route to that. How can we better design those systems to facilitate those interactions with the different, whether it's a lawyer, an IP lawyer, it's a specialist accountant, a technology supplier, somebody who can work with, on research. How do we set the right sort of broader, system to support the growth, but growth in a low carbon, resource and inclusive manner. So do we have any other?
I think there's one other point which is probably worth just touching on, because I think it affects kind of quite a number of people, which is, what about the international kind of element? This is a piece of UK research. We deliberately scoped it that way. Obviously, quite a number of these Createchs, they're using cloud platforms in other countries. They're using software maybe that was developed some other part of the world. Their customers are quite international in many cases. So, is it really just about UK local and regional kind of networks and knowledge transfer? And I think the answer to that is probably not. But there's an awful lot that can be done just within the UK, and even just within individual regions within the UK.
And I think another thing that reminded me, again, from our earlier survey that aligns with some of the findings for this, is perhaps because of Brexit, the access to the right level of skills, technical skills. Are they here in the UK? Are we, for example, going to be able to satisfy the 22,000 jobs that, people that are required by the film industry, within the UK? And are we going to have constraints on people coming in that we didn't have 3 to 5 years ago? So again, if we do see great, growth potential in the sector, what can we do to deal with the key issues? Because, these businesses will be about skills, knowledge and technology. And if we can't get the right types of people, and those people aren't available in the universities and can't come to work here, it's going to be a constraint, on the developments of the sector.
Martin, there's a couple of people asking where do they download the report from, and do they get?
So what we'll do is over the next day or so, we will send out a note to all participants with a link to the recording and also to this report and the 2 previous reports, so that will be available by the end of the week. And I think yep,
slides.
Yeah, I think we'll probably add those, to also the relevant part of our sort of website as well. And again, similarly, the tool that we mentioned will be made available. And again, I think perhaps in closing, unless Trevor, you have any other particular points to make, we do welcome, further engagement with people on the call. If you have ideas, if you see, ways of collaboration or other opportunities, please contact us. We are going to be furthering, our work in the Createch sector, building on this. So, you will hear from us again in some guise with some new activities, whether it be a report or some other new developments. But again, thank you very much for all your attention. We will send that information out by the end of the week. And thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you indeed. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers. Bye.